drum synthesis. Okay, I'm going to go straight in and make some drum sounds with the modular. What I'll do is tackle bass drum, snare drum, and hi-hat. Before I start, just to say, I've got my Roland drum machine down here. I'm not cheating. This is simply receiving MIDI sync from Ableton, and then I'm going to use the trigger out to run the sequencer on the modular, which is going to trigger some drum sounds. So that's what's going on there. So in theory, if I press play in Ableton, like that, Ableton's running, and I think I can see my drum machine running as well, so that's excellent. Press the trigger out button. I can see where I'm triggering, currently on the 8th note. So I'll just leave that going. The audio from the synth here is going straight into Ableton, which you can see on the little inset there on the screen. The first channel is just my mic, which I'm mixing into Ableton and just getting that to mute the synth when I speak, just so we don't get both sounds happening at the same time. I'll try and keep that muted if I'm not using it. Okay, so how do we make a kick drum? We're going to need a sound source, and the sound source that I'm going to use for this is the Ripples filter. You might remember the Ripples filter, in common with most analog style filters, will make a sound when you turn the resonance all the way up. It will self-oscillate. Sounds a little bit like this. Yeah, that's crazy loud. Okay. Sounds a bit like that. And yeah. So what we're going to do, first of all, is use an envelope to turn that sound on and off. Now the Ripples filter is designed for this because it has a built-in VCA. And the output I'm using here is the low-pass filter with VCA. So to change the gain of the built-in VCA, we simply need to plug an envelope into the gain input on Ripples. And here's an envelope down here. And obviously to make the envelope work, we need to trigger it. So what I'll do, I think, is get the drum machine running the sequencer so that we can use the trigger row on the sequencer to do this. Or actually, better still, what I could do is get the drum machine running at 16 note trigger, clocking grids, so that I can make little drum patterns and record them into Ableton. That's a good thing to do, isn't it? Okay, so the trigger output from the bass drum channel, which is that one there, will go into my envelope, gate in, there we go, and that will trigger the envelope every time Grids decides that there's going to be a bass drum. What that should also do is change the volume on Ripples, therefore kind of making a basic bass drum sound. So this we can see as the kind of, I don't know, almost like kind of the body of the bass drum. And we can use the same envelope to create the kick on the bass drum, but I'm kind of a fan of using two envelopes to make this sound. So what I'm going to do is split the output from Grids into a multiple, and then I'll use two more cables to send one of those triggers to gate number 1 there, and the other one to another gate. I'll just use the VC ADSR down here for this. In fact, no, I'm not going to do that because I'm going to need that for my hi-hats later on. Let's use this ADSR over here. We're going to have volume, and then we're going to have modulation here, and then this envelope will go into the FM input ripples. So this envelope, envelope 1, that's the overall time for the bass drum sound. So we can go short, we can go long, and then this one here is kind of like a percussive edge to the drum sound. Controlled here by the modulation amount, with the cutoff providing a kind of bass pitch for the bass drum. And voila, bass drum. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is make a hi-hat pattern. Grids will create a trigger output for a, let me just stop that. It will create a trigger output for a hi-hat, but I'm actually going to use the trigger sequencer here to do that job. So to make that work, what I first have to do is take my clock output from the drum machine and split it between the sequencer and, now this cable's not long enough, is it? I'm going to reach over and get some more cables. Just off camera, I've got a chair of cables. Alright, so the clock is split here on another multiple so that it goes to the drum machine, so that it goes to the derp, so that it goes to the sequencer and to grids. So both things are in step. So I just stop Ableton for a sec. All right, there we go. So, how do we make a hi-hat? I did this a couple of times in session with mixed success. What we need for a hi-hat, I think, are two sources. I think we need something to make a sort of clanky metallic sound, and we need something to make a kind of unpitched noise sound. The noise bit's easy because there's a noise generator. The clanky metallic bit's a little more difficult, and there are a couple of ways of going about it. One thing we could do is use ring modulation. So you put two oscillators through a ring mod, provided they're not at exactly the same frequency or an exact multiple of each other, you'll get sort of atonal, clangy, metallic sounds. Or we could use FM, frequency modulation, which in a similar way will create sort of atonal, clangorous sounds. I'm going to use ring modulation. So I'm going to take two oscillators. This one. That's a sine wave output. Now I'm using this oscillator here. It's exactly the same as the one up there because this one's got a slightly shaky octave switch. Although this one's missing its writing, it's a little more reliable. So that goes into one input on my ring modulator. And I need another oscillator, so I'm going to use, well, let's use this one. I'll use two triangle waves actually, that's probably quite a good idea. So two triangle waves go into the ring modulator, then what comes out reaches for another cable. What comes out is this. so we can tune it to make a variety of horrible sort of atonal sounds. I mean, it's interesting to note how the position of the tuning controls on the oscillators really doesn't appear to bear a whole lot of relation to the actual pitch of the sound. Gross. So probably have that as part of the sound and then mix that in with some noise. So what I also need is a noise generator and a mixer. So I'll pass my ring mod out to this VCA over here, which can be controlled in a little while by an envelope. And I will also pass my noise source through the same VCA. And then if I listen to the output, I've got that noise and that noise. So kind of noise and a clang. Right. The next thing to do is modulate that with an envelope. So, more cables. I'll use the VCA ADSR, and I'll explain why in a second. That cable just about reaches. So that's going to modulate my envelope. This should work. Doesn't sound that hi-hatty right now. I mean, if anyone's mic'd up a hi-hat badly, you'll know that you sometimes get a lot of low-frequency content in your hi-hats, and typically you'd scoop that out with a high-pass filter. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. So I'll take my hi-hat. That cable is not long enough. Time for one of the big boys. Take my hi-hat, put that into Cinnamon, because Cinnamon has a high pass output. Then that will go back to the mixer on a cable that I dropped on the floor. Hang on. So we take the high pass output. Should have rehearsed this with longer cables. And smaller elbows. We'll take the high pass output back to the mixer, and now I have a thing that sounds possibly a bit more like a hi-hat. Let's get it triggering alongside my bass drum, which I'll just turn down for a second. So the sequence is running, and I can take any of these rows as a trigger output, bearing in mind that the first 3 rows are actual triggers, that is a sudden blip of voltage, a little bit like that plosive I just into the mic there, a sudden change in voltage, and the bottom row is a gate. So if I turn all the gate switches on, you actually end up with one long massive gate. They all join up together. So actually, although a trigger isn't as useful to make an envelope do its thing, on this sequencer it is the only option really, because otherwise I wouldn't be able to have a trigger per step. So I'm going to take the top row out here into the trigger in on the VC ADSR. And now I'm just going to spend a little bit of time tinkering with the 2 oscillators, the mix of the noise and the metal sound, and the cutoff on the filter, till I've got something that I'm quite happy with. Okay, so we can do something quite interesting with the VC ADSR as well, which is we can control the release time with a control voltage. I'm going to use the bottom rail on the sequencer for this. And the output for that is just there. You can see that just there. So that output is going to go into the CV in on my release time. So using this, I should be able to mimic a kind of closed and open hi-hat sound. Which gives it a bit more life, a bit more character. Hey, that sounds like a hi-hat. All right, the patch is getting quite big, so I'm going to finish off with the snare drum. Okay, how do we make a snare drum? Short answer is we don't. Making the snare drum is very difficult. We could approximate a snare drum using some of the modules on the synth. A bit like the hi-hat, so we could use 2 oscillators and mix in a noise source. And if you wanted to really get into drum synthesis, you can look up how to do this. So there's some good articles. There's one on Sound, if I recall, on the kind of inner workings of the original TR-808 and how the snare drum's made. I'm going to cheat because I know that the Platts oscillator has got a snare drum built into it. What I'm going to do is use the snare trigger from Grids to trigger Platts and make a snare drum. I mean, sometimes the easy way is the best way, isn't it? So my trigger from here goes into the trigger on Platts. Almost like they thought about that. I could pass that through a filter if I wanted to, but I'm not going to for now. We take the output of Platts into another channel on the mixer. And then change the sound in Platts so that it sounds like a snare. Cool. Okay, it's like, now what? Obviously I've filled up my synth with patch cables and used a fair few modules on those drum sounds. The answer to now what is a coffee out shot. The answer to now what is I'm just going to record all those sounds into Ableton for use later on. At this point I sort of don't care what the pattern is because I can chop them up in audio. But what I am going to do is just sort of record them in. Hang on a sec. Okay. So we'll rename track 1. Kick. Yoke. Okay. Kick drum. I've set the system up so that the MIDI sync has got a slight delay on it, meaning that if I track this straight into the track in Ableton, it should seamlessly lock back into the groove. There shouldn't be any latency. I've experimented with a few ways of doing this, and a MIDI sync to a drum machine with a bit of delay on seems to be the best way forward. I think that's a little quiet. New track. Rename. Alright, cool. Now I can happily unpatch my synth and move on to the next sound, which will be in the next video.